Hi. In the minds of many, the Ukraine war has become synonymous with the rise of military drones. We've seen drones rapidly expanding in terms of their capabilities and their diversity. Drones can do all sorts of things, and it's really impressive. And not only that, but it also seems to those of us who've been watching that drones are completely reshaping the nature of modern warfare. That there's sort of now a before and an after, and nothing will ever be the same. Drones also, the rise of drones has also, I think, fueled lots of speculation as to whether or not drones basically are replacing other kinds of weapons as in terms of their importance and making other sorts of things obsolete. In fact, particularly with artillery, there's been a lot of speculation about whether or not drones have supplanted artillery's traditional role as the king of the battlefield. That's what I want to talk about in this video. My name is Michael Shurkin, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana, a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be on my mind. Now, I confess to having been a little bit skeptical at first about this question about whether or not drones have replaced artillery as the king of the battlefield, because it's easy to see how drones have captured the public imagination, given that there's a steady source of the drones are a steady source of really dramatic battlefield video. I mean, it's kind of unprecedented, some of the stuff that we're able to see now, specifically on social media. My own Twitter feed is awash in videos, mostly from first-person view drones of soldiers and vehicles coming to grief. It's as if these weapons are actually designed for social media, but of course, what one sees on social media is not necessarily representative of the truth. What did he just say? What one sees on social media is not necessarily representative of the truth. That's a truly radical idea. I know. So let's forget about all these cool viral videos and let's try to focus on facts and what facts that there are. Now, just before I get more into it, just a word on sourcing. Most of the information that I have, and most of the analysis that I have read regarding drones comes from a number of studies published by the Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, of which I happen to have the honor of being an associate fellow. And when it comes to Ukraine, there's extraordinary work done above all by Sam Cranny Evans and the great Jack Watling. Both of these guys are excellent analysts. They're also terrific people. I haven't crunched the numbers or talked to Ukrainian soldiers, but they have, and I trust them. Okay, so now the key statistic that I see most of the time is the following. Drones reportedly are responsible now, 2025, for roughly 2/3 of Russian losses in Ukraine. That's a lot. And they're responsible for a comparable number of Ukrainian losses in the war. Now, let's try to look at this with a bit more specificity. I tried to, using open sources and using my AI, I use the AI Perplexity, which, with all these AIs, it's like, the results are, you have to be careful. Like, these are not hills that you want to die on, but still, I feel like it's good enough and it serves the purpose, our purposes. Certainly it serves my purposes. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to compare casualties, given the available information about like, what is the source of what percentage of casualties on the Ukrainian side in the Ukraine war. And what I found is the following. Drones, specifically, mostly first-person view drones and loitering munitions, are responsible in 2025 for 60 to 75% of Ukrainian battle casualties. They have been the primary cause of casualties since 2024. Before that, it was artillery. Currently, 2025, artillery and rockets, so tube and rocket artillery, are responsible for 20 to 30% of Ukrainian battle casualties. Mines and booby traps are responsible for 10 to 15%. And small arms fire, we're talking rifles and machine guns and snipers, are responsible for less than 10% of Ukrainian battle casualties, which is really very minor compared to all the other kinds of threats. From what I could tell, these statistics are more or less the same for the Russian casualties in this war. Now, to be clear, by all accounts, until this year, and this is what we need to understand, so drones clearly are the major killer in this war, but until this year, artillery really was the chief killer in this war, particularly of Ukrainian soldiers. Now, I want to do some comparisons to sort of give you an idea of what makes this interesting, what makes this new, by looking at some past historical wars and looking at the data about what killed most people most of the time. So, for instance, let's do some quick comparisons. For World War II, artillery in all of its various forms accounted for roughly 2/3 of all casualties And I find the following statistics for U.S. combat casualties. There is some variation. The variation apparently is theater specific. So, artillery and mortars caused 50 to 70% of casualties. Small arms, 25 to 35% of all casualties. So again, rifles, machine guns, and submachine guns. Mines and grenades caused 3 to 5% of casualties, and bombs accounted for less than 5% of battlefield deaths, although obviously bombs cause a very high civilian toll. Now, out of curiosity, I looked up Wehrmacht battle casualties to see if the Germans were killed in similar numbers by similar things. Now, understandably, it looks like a somewhat greater percentage of Germans were killed or wounded by artillery, which makes sense given that most of the casualties were due to the Red Army, and the Red Army is notorious for its heavy use of artillery. Anyways, for the German Wehrmacht, fully 65 to 75% of battlefield casualties were due to artillery and mortars. 20 to 25% of casualties were due to small arms. 3 to 5% were due to mines and grenades, and less than 5% were due to aerial bombing. In case you were wondering, because I was wondering sort of how my mind works, I thought, well, what about German casualties in the First World War? Interesting. The casualties are more or less the same. So in the First World War, Germans suffered 60 to 70% of the battlefield casualties to artillery, 25 to 35% machine guns and rifles, 2 to 3% gas, less than 2% grenades, and a variable a percentage for disease and non-combatants. So I read 10 to 20% of total deaths. It's not really clear. One thing that this makes clear is that World War I, the big killer, clearly, just like with World War II, and it's more or less the same proportions, is artillery. And this is something that a lot of us don't it doesn't quite match the popular imagination. I've heard people say that the biggest killer in World War I and the whole reason for the trenches was machine guns. It's actually, that's not true. The reason for the high casualty rate in World War I and the reason for which people would dig trenches and go underground was actually modern artillery, because modern artillery was far more lethal than had ever been before. Simply because modern artillery, because it now had breech loading mechanisms and it had hydraulic systems for absorbing recoil, meant that you didn't have to move them back into place every time you fired. They could stay more or less stationary. You basically had a much higher rate of fire. Plus, with modern artillery and modern communication systems, you could do a much better job of indirect fire, right? So that you're shooting at things that you can't even see or things that might even be over the horizon. So that made, plus just the quantity of artillery pieces enabled by modern industry, 20th century industry. So basically artillery became the killer of the 20th century, which was not exactly the case previously. Just to underscore this point, out of curiosity, I tried to do the same kind of analysis with the United States Civil War, with both sides together. And there you see that the primary killer of the U.S. Civil War was disease. And I believe this is true for all wars everywhere up until the 20th century. The biggest single killer is disease. So, according to what I found, disease and infection were responsible for 66% of all deaths. I'm not talking battle deaths, but deaths. Next to that comes small arms fire, specifically rifled muskets. They are accountable for 80 to 80% of all combat deaths. Artillery is only responsible for 10 to 15% of combat deaths. Bayonets and melee weapons are responsible for less than 1% of deaths. And then there's a small remainder owing to accidents like drownings and that sort of thing. If you've gotten this far in this video, please hit like and subscribe if you have not subscribed already. Likewise, you can, if you feel so inspired, throw me some money using the thanks button here on YouTube, or also you can buy me a coffee using the link in the description. Similarly, on YouTube, you can also choose to become a member to provide more sustained support. Either way, I deeply appreciate the support. I absolutely need it in order to keep doing this. So thank you very much. Okay, so let's go back to Ukraine. Drones have overtaken artillery as the main killer. So pre-20th century, disease is the main killer. 20th century, artillery is the main killer. Now, in Ukraine, drones have overtaken artillery as the main killer. And the news, of course, is replete with stories about how both Ukraine and Russia are investing vast resources into producing gigantic numbers of drones. Ukraine reportedly now makes over 200,000 drones of all types. this year, which is a 900% increase compared even to just 2024. The goal is to make somewhere between 2.4 and 4.5 million drones this year, and up to 10 million drones per year in the years to come, if funding holds. It's reasonable to assume that the Ukrainians know what they're doing and that they evidently see immense value in drones. I mean, why else would they be making so much? In fact, from what I read, Ukraine is now spending 3 times the amount of money on drones as it is on tube artillery. And by the way, they now have 155 millimeter howitzer production up to about 40 howitzers per month, which really isn't bad. That's pretty impressive. The main argument for drones is cost effectiveness. Drones vary considerably in cost depending on the size and the capabilities. A big American MQ-9 drone costs as much as $30 million a pop. It's like a fighter plane. While the Turkish TB2 is $4 to $8 million a piece. But these days, the battlefield is really dominated by much smaller and cheaper drones, smaller, less capable, and cheaper drones. So those Iranian Shahed drones that the Russians are so fond of, those reportedly now cost below $30,000, below $30,000 to $50,000 a piece. And many drones are much cheaper, with some of the smaller FPV drones coming in at about $500. So it's not hard to understand the appeal of destroying a multi-million-dollar tank with a weapon that costs under $1,000. So it just makes sense. Now, in contrast, howitzers and artillery is just really expensive. So just to give you some examples. First of all, if you're relying on artillery, you need a howitzer. So the standard American M777 towed howitzer costs about $2.5 million. And the self-propelled variant, the M109, it costs around $10 to $20 million per unit, depending on the modernity of the stuff that, how cutting edge is the extras and the features, and, you can pimp it in all sorts of ways. The more capable German PZH 2000 costs a whopping $18 to $20 million. In contrast, the cheaper Korean K9 self-propelled howitzer is about $8 to $11 million. Happily, the Bodana howitzers that Ukraine is now manufacturing at a rate of 40 a month is a lot cheaper. They cost about $3 million for a self-propelled variant and $1.5 million for a towed variant. But still, it's expensive, right? And then there are the shells. 155 millimeter shells vary considerably by cost depending on the source and also the level of sophistication. The standard U.S. Army 155 millimeter shell is $3,000 per shell. European shells apparently cost a little bit more like $4,000 or $5,000. Precision-guided shells are super expensive. They cost between $70,000 and $100,000. Keep that in mind when you read about how precision shells enable one to have the same effect while firing fewer shells, because firing more dumb shells might actually still be cheaper than firing a single precision shell. A single guided shell costs the same as about 2 dozen dumb shells. So if you want to destroy a target with fewer, or if you can destroy a target with fewer than 2 dozen dumb shells, it's actually cheaper than if you were to use a single precision shell. So keep that sort of thing in mind. So, okay. Now, to make matters worse, the howitzer, which, as we've already established, is a very expensive piece of kit, is a large item that can easily be found and destroyed. And it is much more difficult to detect in comparison to detect a bunch of soldiers who are operating a drone. The guys operating a drone might be in the basement of a building or something like that. Howitzer you can't hide as easily, so they're very vulnerable. Ukraine has already lost 600 to 700 howitzers in the war, all types included. Howitzers also require robust logistical trains. You need trucks that supply the shells and drag them around, and everything else that's required to provision the howitzers with the shells and get from the depots to the shells and get the shells to the depots, all that sort of thing. All of these elements can be droned or shelled or whatever. If you put this all together, you come up with the idea that drones are the superior weapon. Is this true? Well, not so fast. Some of the reports I've read have argued that the statistic that the Ukrainians kill more Russians with drones than with howitzers are misleading, because ultimately, according to these reports, the reason why the Ukrainians use the drones more than the howitzers is not because they prefer the drones to the howitzers, but just because they have few howitzers and can only afford to make so many, or it's difficult for them to make a much larger number. basically because of the battle losses. So it's not like a case of all things being equal. If all things are equal and you've got, and if the Ukrainian army could use whatever it wanted to use in the numbers it wanted to use, it would actually use howitzers, but it can't. So it's using the drones. So it's not the plan A, it's rather the plan B of the Ukrainian army. This whole thing reminds me of a study that I did when I was at the Rand Corporation, when I looked into the military use of motorcycles. One of these days, I really ought to make a video just about that Rand study, because it's really fascinating, because I got into horses and bicycles and mules and that kind of thing. Anyways, one of the things I noticed was that the German Wehrmacht in World War II made extensive use of motorcycles and motorcycles in tandem with motorcycle sidecars. And I wondered whether there was a reason for this in terms of doctrine or tactics. Did the Wehrmacht see in motorcycles certain capabilities that made them valuable in the eyes of the Wehrmacht? Is there an argument that might even pertain today to having motorcycles, and heck, motorcycles and motorcycle sidecars, that were they onto something? Were the Germans onto something? But what I found when I looked into the matter was that actually no. The reason why Germany used motorcycles in such extensive numbers in World War II is because they didn't have the industrial capacity to make more cars or jeeps or light trucks or whatever it is that you might use that we, the Americans, were able to do in same numbers. So their auto industry, which, as we know, the German auto industry is excellent, but small relative to the American auto industry. The Americans turning out millions of jeeps and small trucks and light trucks and all that kind of thing, that's really easy for us. The Germans couldn't do it. What the Germans did have is the capacity to make large numbers of high-quality motorcycles. So they went for the motorcycles, not because that's what the Wehrmacht wanted, but simply because that's what they could do. It's the same thing with what the argument thus is that the Ukrainian reliance on drones has less to do with the military virtues of drones than it has to do with Ukrainian industrial capacity and the Ukrainians' ability to generate large numbers of drones, vice large numbers of artillery and artillery shells. That's the argument. Similarly, from what I've read, another reason why such a large percentage of Russian vehicle losses are now due to drones is because Ukrainian tube and artillery and rocket artillery has actually forced the Russians to disperse. And once they're dispersed, drones are actually better at hunting down the dispersed items and killing them. So the drones are doing this because artillery has actually done its job. Moreover, there are numerous reasons why ultimately artillery remains superior and preferable to drones, like all things being equal. So first of all, artillery is all weather. That's a very big deal in large parts of the world, including Ukraine. Second, artillery is more responsive. If you know that there's a target at a certain place, or perhaps an enemy breakthrough at a certain place, it's far faster to hit that location hard with artillery shells than it is to maneuver drones to the right place and in the right numbers. Third, drones can in fact be defeated by various means, including camouflage, electronic warfare, and counter-drone fires. And counter-drone fires could even just be a dude with a shotgun. So only a relatively small percentage of drones actually reach their target and do any damage. We don't see this in the viral videos because we don't see FPV footage of the drones that smash into trees or just fall out of the sky. We're only seeing the stuff that dramatically manages to get close to a Russian tank and go through a hatch, something like that. So we see the successes, but we don't see the failures. Counter-drone methods also are steadily improving. They're getting better and better. They're getting cheaper and cheaper. And they limit one's ability to mass drones and thus make them, and massing drones is essential if you want to try to make them the equivalent of artillery, because artillery is relatively easy to mass. Also, with things like camouflage netting, that's not going to stop a 155 millimeter shell, nor is a guy with a shotgun going to be able to stop an artillery barrage. It's just not going to happen. And finally, fourth, there's really nothing like the effects of mass artillery fire for sheer destructiveness. And even better, there's nothing like the effectiveness of guided aerial bombs when possible, meaning that there remains a strong argument for investing in air superiority whenever that is feasible. Also, it's interesting to note, and this is something that the Rusi authors write about, but it appears to be the case that when the front is largely static, drones become more useful because of their responsiveness. or rather because the relative responsiveness of artillery is not as much of an advantage as it would be if the front was dynamic. So when the fronts are dynamic, artillery really comes to the fore, and its advantage relative to drones becomes much larger. What's emerging in Ukraine is not evidence that drones will replace artillery, but rather that the real magic happens when drones and artillery complement each other and achieve synergies. The most obvious example is the use of drones for identifying targets for artillery. Both Ukraine and Russia have been putting a lot of energy and a lot of thought into figuring out how to optimize drones' ability to provide targeting information to artillery and speed up that relay of information and speed up the responsiveness so that the sooner a drone sees something and that information gets shared with the artillery and the artillery fires, you want to speed that up as much as possible, and that's really where the magic happens. In effect, you could say it's all about speeding up the OODA loop. The OODA loop is this famous concept invented, I believe, in the 1970s by the American Air Force, an American Air Force officer named John Boyd. The OODA loop stands for Observe, Orient, Decide, and Act, so OODA. The advent of digital technology has made warfare to a considerable extent a race to execute the OODA loop faster than one's adversary. It's like, in the Old West, it's this quick draw, right? Who can draw their guns the fastest. In modern warfare, it's described in terms of the OODA loop. It's you detect the enemy, you get it, you figure out what it is, you make a decision about what to do about it, and then you actually go and do it. And the sooner you can do that, the faster you can get the jump on your enemy, the more likely it is that you're going to prevail. So it's all about sensors, and it's all about being able to assimilate the information picked up by the sensors, to make sense of it, to make a decision about what to do with the information, and then finally to execute. It's all about speeding up the time, the flow of information, so that the information that the drones pick up gets to the right people in the right time. The technology these days exists for all of it to be done completely automatically, where the drone sees something, a howitzer fires, something gets blown up. It could be completely automatic. It could be done in a matter of seconds. But for various reasons, that's actually a really bad idea. There needs to be people in the loop or on the loop. There's this whole process. People have to be in control because they have to be able to impose upon decisions about when to fire and what to fire at, priorities, strategic priorities, rules of engagement, policies. There are all sorts of reasons why it can't just be this automatic free fire. But figuring out how to manage this and how to make things faster, while also providing enough sort of conscious direction. This is really where a lot of energy is going on modern militaries around the world. So, but all of this means is that you don't have just drones, you don't have just artillery, you ultimately have to have both, and they have to work in a complementary way. Also, lastly, it should be stated that, as the Rusi reports, or one of them pointed out, Ukraine's masterful use of drones has not brought it victory, right? So Ukraine's better at drones than the Russians, but the Ukrainians aren't necessarily winning, which suggests that the drones and what the Ukrainians are doing with the drones might be necessary, but it certainly is not sufficient for winning a war. This seems obvious, but it underscores the reality that when faced with a choice between investing in drones and artillery, the correct answer is both. And this is a real problem for militaries, because it's also the same can be said for choices between all sorts of different capabilities. More often than not, the correct answer is both, or all of the above. So do you want capability A, B, or C? More often than not, the correct answer is yes. The fact that Ukraine spends 3 times on drones what it spends on artillery doesn't necessarily mean that that's what Ukraine would prefer to be able to spend. It might simply mean that that's what Ukraine can do. We're back to my lesson about the Wehrmacht's use of motorcycles. It's not that the Wehrmacht wanted to be using motorcycles, it's just that they had the military capacity to make gigantic numbers of motorcycles. This ratio of 3 to 1, or at least in terms of what the Ukrainians are doing with drones, is not a model that anybody should be following. And it's up to each country, or each country in a sense would have to figure out what is the appropriate balance between drones and artillery based on their own circumstances, their own industrial capabilities, etc. It all really depends. Anyways, I hope you liked this video. Thank you for watching. If you look in the description, I've put links to my social media in Twitter, Blue Sky, my own website, michaelshirkin.com. Also, I have a Substack that goes by the same name, Pax Americana. And stay tuned. There is a lot more in the description. If you've gotten this far in this video, please hit like and subscribe if you have not subscribed already. Likewise, you can, if you feel so inspired, throw me some money using the thanks button here on YouTube, or also you can buy me a coffee using the link in the description. Similarly, on YouTube, you can also choose to become a member to provide more sustained support. Either way, I deeply appreciate the support. I absolutely need it in order to keep doing this. So thank you very much.